Welcome, viewers. Today we explore a man whose deep agony finally shattered his silent faith. You were always taught that Job was the great symbol of silent patience, never questioning God. But the hidden truth is much darker and profound. He demanded a trial to lawfully sue God. What truly happens when a shattered mortal boldly demands clear answers from the stormy heavens? Let us travel back to the ancient land of Uz, where a storm of divine wrath is about to start. According to the ancient scriptures, Job had lost his entire fortune in a single tragic day. His beloved children met a devastating fate beneath the collapsed walls of their own grand home. Now, this once wealthy patriarch sits alone in the filthy ashes of his ruined, burned estate. His fragile body is completely covered from head to toe in unspeakable, painful wounds. He scrapes his infected skin with a broken piece of clay pottery, shivering in the cold wind. For 7 long days and 7 dark nights, his friends sat beside him without speaking a single word. They were absolutely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his unnatural, terrifying grief. The silence was incredibly heavy, thicker than the dark storm clouds gathering over the mountains. Finally, the fragile breaking point arrived. The human limit for endurance was suddenly crossed. Job opened his parched mouth and let out a devastating wail that echoed across the barren hills. He cursed the very day of his birth, wishing that dense darkness had swallowed his mother's tragic womb. "Let the day perish on which I was born," he screamed in agony into the relentlessly howling wind. He fiercely wished he had never existed, desperately wanting to erase his entire life. Historical scholars note this level of raw emotional honesty was incredibly rare then. It was a dangerous, direct challenge to established traditions of total submission. His so-called wise friends were deeply shocked by these dark, seemingly blasphemous words escaping his lips. They quickly began to angrily accuse him, insisting he committed some hidden sin. Their rigid, ancient theology dictates that awful suffering only punishes wicked men. They argued that God's absolute cosmic justice operates like a simple, predictable machine. But Job fiercely rejected their shallow religious logic with every ounce of his broken strength. He knew deeply inside his wounded heart that he was entirely innocent of any secret crimes. His righteous indignation began to burn much hotter than the physical pain ravaging his flesh. The ashes on his skin suddenly felt like the heavy armor of a battle-hardened warrior. Instead of crumbling into total despair, he steadily gathered his remaining shattered courage. He refused to falsely confess to sins he never committed just to appease his angry friends. The ancient sky grew much darker, mirroring the terrible emotional storm inside his fragile soul. He slowly pushed himself upward, his trembling, ruined legs barely able to support his frail frame. Every agonizing movement felt like a million sharp daggers piercing his intensely swollen joints. Yet he finally stood upright, directly facing the howling winds of the desolate wasteland. This was no longer a pitiful, broken victim, quietly begging for gentle divine mercy. This was a deeply wounded, furious human, preparing for a massive, cosmic legal battle. Job fiercely wiped the thick, dirty sweat and dark crimson blood away from his severely, deeply sunken eyes. He completely ignored the terrified gasps of his religiously strict, highly conservative friends. Instead of whispering a humble prayer, he tore apart the traditional boundaries of human faith. He desperately demanded a literal trial with the supreme creator of the universe.
I will not yield until you answer.
I would speak to the Almighty, and I strongly desire to argue my righteous case directly with God.
Serve this.
His booming, raspy voice cut through the heavy, deafening thunder echoing across the dark valley. To fully understand this moment, we must realize how rebellious this awesome, bold action was. In the ancient Near East, humans were considered nothing more than useless dust beneath divine feet. Mortals were expected to suffer in total, unquestioning silence whenever the gods grew angry. Yet here stood a dying man, drafting a spiritual lawsuit against the sovereign Lord of Heaven. Job passionately demanded that God step down from his eternal throne and take the awful witness stand. If you lost everything you loved, would you quietly bow down or demand a fair legal trial? Job presented his extensive arguments with the brilliant precision of a master attorney.
Why do you hide your face from me, treating me as your enemy?
He carefully laid out his flawless moral record, challenging God to find a single fatal flaw. Let me be carefully weighed in a completely just and balanced cosmic scale, he loudly declared. He was convinced that if given a fair hearing, his ultimate innocence would be fully proven. His pious friends recoiled in absolute horror, covering their ears from his dark and awful blasphemy. To them, questioning the Almighty's divine judgment was an unforgivable, dangerous crime. But Job recognized a much deeper, profound truth that traditional religion had completely missed. True, authentic faith does not blindly hide behind empty religious rituals when life shatters.
I endure this pain.
True faith boldly wrestles with God in the darkness, desperately demanding an honest answer.
To deserve this.
Call, and I will strictly answer, or let me speak, and you strictly reply to me, he roared into the gale. The heavy storm winds brutally lashed his incredibly fragile body, threatening to blow him away. He wrapped his torn, muddy sackcloth tighter around his severely aching, exposed, open wounds. Job was an incredible speck of dust, proudly standing against the vast power of the cosmos. His profound, undeniable suffering had ultimately stripped away all his fearful politeness. He refused to simply accept the incredibly simplistic, flawed theology of his foolish friends. Job firmly believed that a truly just and righteous God would never hide from an honest debate. This fiery confrontation marks a monumental paradigm shift in ancient history. It powerfully teaches that profound human suffering is rarely a punishment for secret sins. And most importantly, it shows that the divine creator is never threatened by our deepest pain. As his desperate screams faded, the chaotic atmosphere suddenly grew terrifyingly still. The eerie, heavy silence was far more intimidating than the deafening roars of his angry friends. Job held his breath, his exhausted lungs burning intensely as he stared into the blackening horizon. Would the Almighty actually answer a lowly mortal's audacious legal summons? Would an infinite God bother to acknowledge the desperate complaints of a dying speck of dust? Scholars agree this specific moment represents the ultimate climax of human theology. It profoundly questions whether the sovereign creator cares about individual justice. Job continued to stand his ground, firmly refusing to retreat or lower his challenging gaze. His frail, trembling arms remained stretched wide open, exposing his vulnerable chest to the angry sky. He was entirely prepared to be struck down by a massive, blinding bolt of divine lightning. At this exact critical moment, he honestly preferred fiery death over divine silence. Have you ever felt so crushed by tragedy that you fiercely demanded a clear explanation from God? Job's remarkable defiance is what makes this ancient poetic text so brilliant and timeless. It strictly refuses to sanitize the awful, ugly reality of profound human grief. It powerfully validates the anger of those who endure senseless, fatal tragedies. Slowly and terrifyingly, the vast, stormy heavens began to respond to his bold challenge. The oppressive silence was suddenly shattered by a deep, earth-shaking, terrifying, distant rumble. It was not just thunder. It was the awful, unmistakable sound of reality tearing apart. Job's eyes widened in sheer disbelief as the dark storm clouds began to violently swirl inward. The three arrogant friends instantly fell to their trembling knees, burying their faces in the mud. They were absolutely petrified, expecting the supreme wrath of the Almighty to crush them. But Job did not flinch. He maintained his defiant stance, staring directly into the massive vortex. The massive, violent, spinning cyclone was rapidly descending toward his fragile hilltop. Flashes of pure golden lightning rapidly lit up the dark dust surrounding his frail, wounded body. The air pressure dropped so intensely that every breath felt like inhaling crushed, burning glass. He had demanded a trial, and now the supreme cosmic judge was arriving in awful fury. His heavy heart pounded against his painful ribs, matching the deafening thunderclaps above. Yet, even as the magnificent whirlwind threatened to consume him, Job refused to kneel down. He clutched his sharp, broken pottery, a pathetic weapon against the boundless power of God. The ancient text vividly shows this clash between mortal agony and infinite divinity. We witness the ultimate moment where a broken man firmly demands cosmic accountability. And then, the massive, swirling storm enveloped the desolate hilltop, swallowing all existing light. Out of the terrifying whirlwind, the majestic, booming voice of the Lord finally answered Job. The furious, raging storm did not immediately strike him dead, as his terrified friends had assumed. Instead, the breathtaking divine presence completely surrounded his deeply broken, fragile body. God did not offer a simple apology or a neat theological explanation. The Creator responded by powerfully showing the vast and awesome scale of the cosmos. He painted a majestic, amazing picture of wild beasts, deep oceans, and brilliant constellations. God's profound cosmic message was not about crushing Job, but expanding his limited vision. The Almighty proved that His divine wisdom is far beyond human comprehension or earthly logic. But more importantly, the Lord fully validated Job's honest quest for perfect, true justice. God sternly rebuked the three friends for their rigid, cruel, and completely false religious dogma. The Creator deeply honored the raw, hurting honesty of a man pushed to his absolute limit. The ancient text reveals an incredibly shocking, comforting truth about human suffering. The sovereign God of the universe is undeniably big enough to handle your anger. He never demands fake, polite smiles when your entire world is violently falling apart. Job's desperate, screaming complaints were ultimately accepted as a very profound form of prayer. True faith is not just quiet submission. It is fiercely wrestling with the dark, divine mystery. Job stood boldly inside the terrifying whirlwind, feeling fully seen by his great Creator. The heavy physical pain remained, but the crushing isolation was finally broken. He did not receive all the answers, but he got the supreme presence of the Almighty Himself. The terrifying, massive storm began to fade, leaving a profound silence in its divine wake. Job gently lowered his trembling hands, dropping the sharp, broken piece of ruined clay pottery. He slowly fell to his muddy knees, no longer in total despair, but in deep, overwhelming awe. The dark, heavy storm clouds parted, allowing a single warm ray of golden sunlight to break through. His incredible journey forever changed how humanity understands suffering and faith. Job bravely taught us that bringing our deepest rage to God is an act of supreme, radical trust. The ancient epic trial concludes, leaving behind a legacy of profound vulnerability. Job's bold anger forces us to ask a profound question about the true nature of human suffering. Was his bold rebellion a terrible sin, or the most honest prayer spoken? Share your thoughts below. If this historical journey moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more epic biblical deep dives.